Tomorrow will be 60 years since late Rosh Yeshiva Rabbi Ahron Kotler was nifter. I think that Rabbi Yechiel Kotler put it best when she referred to it. I heard her many times. She called it the day of the Churban. I don't think that any of you can possibly appreciate what America was like 70, 80 years ago. And therefore what kind of impact, what unbelievable impact the Rosh Yeshiva had, what his accomplishment was. I went to a local yeshiva, and fortunately my father took me out. I think it was 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. And he went with me privately at home. The other kids in yeshiva, they had the yeshiva curriculum. Of all the kids in my class, I don't remember how big a class it was probably 15, 16 kids. So all the kids in my class, 2 beside myself were in Shomer Shabbos. And that, I don't think, was unusual for America. One was a Shomer Shabbos to a degree because he was a conservative rabbi. And the other one was a Balabatish guy. Probably 20 years ago, I got a phone call from somebody, Barry Levine, who wanted to renew a contact with me. We had both been in elementary school together, and he had been a buddy of mine. And he called me up out of the blue, and I had a conversation with him. And he mentioned that he has 3 children, and they all married goyim. He said it with regret, I have to say. But seif l'seif, I think that was pretty typical of what was going on. Fortunately, as I said, my father took me out. I went there only for English, where I had my buddies. But Limudi Kodesh was a private affair with my father. My father first took me to Cedar Yeshiva when I was maybe 9 years old. And I remember the visit because Reb Schneier tested me on Sefer Bereshis. I remember Schneier very well. He tore his beard. And he told the Yeshiva did very well. The second visit is what I remember even more clearly. The second visit was around when I was probably 13 or so, graduating. All the kids in my class, not all, but almost all the kids in my class were receiving graduation rings. Their parents bought them gold rings. The yeshiva also was offering a ring that they offered, or I don't remember what kind of ring it was, but it was expensive. My parents didn't have a lot of money, although we never felt poor, I have to tell you. And I never expected to have a ring. It was just not what's going to happen. I didn't miss it. I didn't mourn it. But I know I wasn't going to have one. But my father had an aunt. She was his mother's sister who lived in New York. And she had 3 daughters. And the 3 daughters were very close with each other and close with my father, who they were first cousins. And one day they showed up, and they brought me a gold ring. I couldn't believe it. I have a gold ring. I didn't expect such a thing. They brought me a gold ring for my graduation, maybe. I don't remember clearly, graduation or bar mitzvah. They brought me a gold ring, and I had a gold ring. I put it on. It was unbelievable. I took care of it. I was very careful when I put it away. And Yeshiva And my father took me on one of the next visits. He took me to see the Rosh Yeshiva. And of course, going to see the Rosh Yeshiva, you don't go just, in shmatas, you dress up a little bit. And I put on my gold ring very proudly. And on the way back, we're sitting on the subway. I remember very clearly this part. My father said to me, the Rosh Yeshiva said, you shouldn't wear a ring. And I said to my father, what's the reason? My father said, if the Rosh Yeshiva said so, that's reason enough. And I took off the ring. I put it in my back right pocket and never put it on again. I didn't understand. Absolutely no clue. What was it about? Why no ring? But it left a mark in me that began a deep understanding of the word Ben Torah. Without realizing, without understanding what it was about, gradually it was the cornerstone of a collection of other pieces of information that finally added up to the idea of a Ben Torah. Ben Torah didn't wear rings. Ben Torah dressed differently than other people. Not major difference. He didn't wear a clown suit or something. But he dressed in a different way, so that it was detectable that he was different. How many Bnei Torah were there in New York? A handful. I remember when I was about 15, maybe 15 and a half, I davened for the first time in Chaim, Berlin, the yeshiva I was going to. And I think it was Shabbos Shuv I davened there. I didn't daven with a hat. Nobody my age wore a hat. 15-year-olds. And one of the older Bochum came over and he told me, the yeshiva said you should wear a hat. The next time I was there was Yom Kippur and I wore a hat, really shmata hat that I had found at home. Awful, but it was a hat. And the yeshivas, I guess it was, the Gabbai came over to me on Yom Kippur and gave me Galila on one of the Svarim, and I knew that of course it was the yeshiva had told me to do so as a reward for wearing a hat. So hard to understand what Yiddishkeit was like at that time. In Yeshiva Gedana, they distributed a magazine called Olamenu, which I think is still being published by an organization called Torah Masorah. You can tell from the name, Torah Masorah, that this is going to be a different kind of organization than the various different groups that were running education in America, such as the JEC, Jewish Education Committee. Changed their name later on to the Board of Jewish Education. They were overseeing chinuch of Jewish children in America. This was different. It was Torah and Masorah. It should be both Torah and Masorah, the way Torah was. So what was Torah and Masorah? They published a magazine. That's the most of what I knew about them. And I couldn't wait to get it because there was a comic on the back of the page. A Jewish comic, not Superman, like all the kids were reading, but a Jewish comic. And the comic was called Dave and His Magic Staff. Dave, in the first panel of the comic, there's a picture of Dave in a beanie, if you know what that was, Most of the kids did not wear yarmulkes because they were afraid to be beaten up by the goyim. I grada wore yarmulke. But the kids wore beanies. So the panel begins by saying Dave was a regular yeshiva guy. And on his day off, he went to Coney Island. Well, what a regular yeshiva guy does on his day off is go to Coney Island, and that's a regular yeshiva guy. And there's a picture of Dave walking down the street in Coney Island. And in the next panel, he sees a strange person standing in front of a store, and he calls him in. Well, it turns out that this person is Eliyahu Hanavi. And Eliyahu Hanavi is going to give him the staff that Moshe Rabbeinu used to make the miracles when he came out of Mitzrayim. He's giving that to Dave, the regular yeshiva boy. I mean, it's Poshet plain. Poshet is, I don't know, I don't want to call that courses, but it is so awful. So awful. And what does Dave wants to first? He wants to throw away the staff, his old stick. Who needs it? But then, while he's holding it, he sees a woman, an old woman about to be hit by a car. And he says, I wish I could save her. And all of a sudden he flies, and he saves her from the car. It's sacrilege. That was Torah and Masorah. That was Torah and Masorah in those days. That was Torah and Masorah in those days. The Masorah was that Eliyahu Hanavi gave him the Mata of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the Masorah. That there was a Mata of Moshe Rabbeinu, there's Eliyahu Hanavi. That was the Masorah. You understand? I'm trying to explain something. What kind of America it was. The Frumkeit was just to be Yosef themselves for Frumkeit. There was no Liman HaTorah, Daf Yomi. There were a couple of old Jews who still went to shul and learned Mishnayos maybe after the davening because they were retired. There was no youth. No one showed up after his bar mitzvah in shul again. Come on, no one. You were bar mitzvahed, and it was over. I remember that I used to work with bar mitzvah boys, and there was, my father made bar mitzvahs on Sunday. The reason he made them on Sunday was because people shouldn't be machal Shabbos with them and park the cars at the shul on Shabbos. It was just too much to bear. So he made Sunday bar mitzvahs. Sunday bar mitzvahs, like the older brother and the other brothers came. They were told, we're going to wear tefillin. Remember, you were given tefillin for your bar mitzvah. So a kid comes, tefillin. I just couldn't resist doing this to him. He opened up the tefillin zekel. I took one look and I saw that I had wrapped up those tefillin 2 or 3 years before. I could tell by the way I wrapped it. So he said, okay, put them on. So he took the shel yad and he opened up the loop and he put it on his head. And it kept sliding down because it's loose in the back. It's not a real knot. There's no knot. And I had no rachmanis on him. I said, okay, now put on the shel rosh. He took out the shel rosh and he looked at it with 2 straps coming down. He had no clue what to do with it. They had rachmanis. I took off the shel yad for over one, that was hanging over one ear, and halfway down his eye on the other one. And I took it off and I started all over with him. I said, what is this? I may have asked him, do you put on tefillin every day? And he probably said yes. Quite a miracle. Nebuch. Into this atmosphere came a man from Europe who escaped for his life, who refused to compromise on the standards of Torah and Yiddishkeit. who didn't speak English, who spoke Yiddish, which some people understood, but it was a heavy European Yiddish, not like in America. In America, Yiddish is the pshat. You say a word and you stick the word dikka on the end. Like, let's say you want to say it's true, you say it's emes dikka. That's not Yiddish. Yiddish say as emes. But garnished, emes dikka, and this is dikka, and that's dikka. That's what you figured how you speak Yiddish. Yiddish is a lot of American words with the word dikka on it. And here is a Yid, welcher gerät Yiddish mit Bakzeh now. How did he do it? It's hard, impossible how he did it. How did he do it? He did it, first of all, with a gewaltige betochen, a gewaltige lishma, and a belief in the power of Torah. He believed what Torah can accomplish. He believed in it. He really believed that Torah would do it. He said shiurim that were above the heads of most of the people who were listening to them. Most of the Bachrim, of course. Above the heads. Well, a guy came to Lakewood in my time. He didn't stay long. He said he can't understand the shir. I don't blame him. It was hard to follow the shir. So I said to this Bacher, he was a younger Bacher, I said to him, why don't you just look at Rosh Yeshiva's face? So he did that. He told me afterwards he got a very big aliyah from his face. See, Rosh Yeshiva would ask a shaila, and then under that shaila he would ask a new shaila, and he would go and work on that shaila from all over Shas. Then he asked another shaila, and he would work on that shaila from all over Shas. And then he would connect the two of them, the two terutzim that he gave, and he answered the first question that he started off with. And at that point, when he connected it, his face shone with such a gewaldige light and such a gewaldige simcha. At the yoifi, at the amitus, there was such an impact on us if we didn't understand. Look at the Avas HaTorah, look at the yoifi of the mensch who's teaching and learning Torah. Of course, you have to know that the people who were in Lakewood in my time, myself is the only exception, I would say. Maybe there was another one. They were there against their parents' will. And if Lakewood was in New York, it would never have succeeded because the parents would have tortured the kids. But it was out of town, so they were away for a while and could breathe against the parents' will, being there. I was visited by a friend of mine I haven't seen in many years. He heard that I wasn't well before Shoshana. I fell down the steps. He came to visit me, and I know him very well. I knew him very well. And I knew his family very well. I knew the father and the mother. I think I met too. I don't remember the mother, but I remember the father. And I knew him as a Yid about the Yid. Kind of Yid that davens, in a shul, in a shtib, because he did daven. A full Yid. And this young man who came to visit me, I say, young man, he's already a grandfather too. So he told me something that summarizes the situation at that time so clearly, better than any description I can give you. I'm going to tell you what he said. He said, my parents were ashamed to say that I was in Lakewood. They were ashamed. Can you believe that? Other people would be talking, oh, my son is going for a bachelor's degree. He'll want to say, oh, well, my son's already in law school. He'll want to say, oh, my son's an accountant probably, even though in accounting. They were ashamed to say, my son is in Lakewood. That explains the situation. I remember when I came to Lakewood, there may be 65 people in the yeshiva, Bochum, and a few Jungelite, a handful. I remember Barnes Levite, there was already about 100 Bochum in yeshiva, 104, I think, precisely. And a couple more Jungelite married. I was already married then, too. And Rabbi Yankov Kamenetsky spoke about at Barnes Levaya, and he said, I think that if we make the yeshiva a little smaller, it may survive. If we make the yeshiva a little smaller, it may survive. Has any of you been in Lakewood recently? What happened? It wasn't made a little smaller by any means. And the yeshiva, what was the yeshiva? I have to tell you that I remember there was a headline on the Lakewood paper. It was a newspaper, a Goysher paper. Rabbi School, dirtiest in county. That was the headline on the front page. The Rabbi School is the dirtiest place, the dirtiest school in the county. And it was. I'm sorry to say it was. How did this happen? Well, as I said earlier, the first thing was B'tochen. How did I know the yeshiva had B'tochen? First of all, I think he had to have B'tochen to do what he did. But beside that, I happened to be one of a group of 3 people who approached the yeshiva and said to him, we'd like to learn with him privately, not during this dorm, but any subject he chooses. We'll go along with any subject, but we'd like to learn with him privately. He said, fine. We'll learn Thursday night, 11 o'clock, whatever, late at night. And he chose a subject. And the subject was Chayvus Halavovis Shar HaBetochen. This is a subject he taught us. He wanted us to understand it, so it was all stories. I wrote down the stories about Reb Zunda Salanta and others. And he picked that mistama because that is the aside of everything. You have to trust the Rebbeinu Shalom is going to help you. He trusted the Rebbeinu Shalom. He took on a job that could not be done. And he did it. I like to tell the story that I think is, to me, a very formative one. And I know many of you have heard it already before, and I'm going to repeat it because I think you have to hear a story like this many times. I don't know if you can understand it from hearing a story without experiencing the story. I don't know if you'll understand it from hearing it 1 time or 10 times. The older guys in Lakewood, of which I was one, put together a chabura to learn. We learned the chaburas then, a small oilam, but we put together a chabura to learn, if I remember correctly, it was Makkos. And there was an older Talmud there among us who had learned already Makkos. And he was going to be the Rosh Chabura because he knew the Masechta. And we took over a corner of the Beis Medrash, and we kicked out a couple of the younger kids, come on, this is our place, whatever. Like you're supposed to do when you're older. And we set up with chavrusas, and even we arranged who's going to sit in this place of the corner, who's going to sit in that place of the corner. It was very well done. And I had a good chavrusa, I have to tell you. And I sat down, and we began learning, and I feel a tap on this shoulder. because that was the shoulder next to the aisle. And the guy just saying, the Rosh Yeshiva wants to see you in his office. Now, the Rosh Yeshiva didn't have any office, I'll tell you the truth. It was like a room that was separate from the rest of the place, but let's call it the office. There was a telephone in it. This probably made an office out of it. The telephone was on the wall. And of course, the well-known number of the yeshiva was 1233. That was the whole number. There was no dial on the phones either. Picked up the phone, and the operator said yes. We told him the number he wanted to call. Anyway, I went into the office. The yeshiva spoke very rapidly, and he told me that they just received the permission from the Vadai of St. Louis to collect money there for 2 weeks in the community, and that I will be going together with so and so, and he's going to give me lists of people that are potentials that I've given before, and that the arrangements will be made for this and this and this. And I couldn't even open my mouth. I was so thunderstruck. And I walked back. I must have had a white face when I came back. I came in there, and I said, "What does Shiva want?" And I said, "He's sending me to St. Louis to raise money." And there was a big response, "What? Don't go." One guy said to me, "Say no to him." He had the guts, Say no to him. Say lo metan aleph. Another guy said to me, "Why should you go? You're not in the kollel. You don't get a check here. Would you eat a potato for supper? For that you have to go to St. Louis? We don't want you to go." Well, I knew it wasn't worth much, but when she was calling back a second time to give me a list of people to go to, so I said to her, she should forgive me in Yiddish, my best Yiddish I could. But just for my own sake, I'd really like to understand why I'm mechuyev to do this, after all. And then I packed in. I'm not in the kollel, and I eat a potato for supper, and I got that within a second and a half. I managed to get that in because I thought it might be good arguments for him. And Rosh Yeshiva said to me, "Do you know why you have to go?" I said, why am I mechuyev to do this? He says, "You know why you're mechuyev? Because you can." To me, that was formative. I went there for 2 weeks to St. Louis, and I learned how to ask people for money, which helped over here quite a bit. I found out you don't have a heart attack when you do it, and that they don't have a heart attack. But the most important thing I found out was that if you can do something, you're mechuyev to do it. If you can bring Torah to America, you're mechuyev to bring Torah to America. If you can stop Yidden from being Machal Shabbos, you're mechuyev to stop them from being Machal Shabbos. If you can save a Jew from going off the derech, you're mechuyev to stop him. If you can't be makar, but you are makar. Whatever you can do, you're mechuyev to do. What makes you mechuyev? Where does it say that? It says it that you can, therefore you must. And that was what Rosh Yeshiva's whole, I would suspect that was beneath everything that he did, because he was the head of Torah Messiah, he was the head of the Aguda, he was the Aguda Sarbonim, and he was involved he was the head of Atzola, and he was at the same time running the Lakewood Yeshiva, and there was nothing he couldn't do. I remember when the Yeshiva had a broken collarbone. And he was in bed by Moshe Golding. Moshe Golding's parents had been very wealthy, and Moshe didn't have the money. I don't know what happened to it, whether he lost it or they lost it. His mother was the famous Dora Golding, after whom there's a camp in the mountains named Camp Dora Golding. They were the old line from Yidden of New York. She gave money to the Chavis Chaim to print the Mission Buras. And Moshe Golding knew that he wanted to stay in this apartment, although he didn't have the resources, the money to live in an apartment like that, a very big apartment up in Manhattan. But it was, to him, the apartment was a holy place because his mother had been there, his parents had been there. He kept the apartment. It had many rooms. The Rashiva was sick, and he was there in Moshe Golding's apartment, and he had it's a long story, but he had a broken collarbone. And he was propped up on pillows, and I was putting tefillin on him. It's very hard to put on tefillin shel rosh if you're leaning back. And for him to move his body was terribly painful in any direction that he had to move it because of the collarbone. He could do nothing for collarbone except suffer and wait for it to heal. So it was a very painful operation getting the shel rosh on him. But he moved his head forward as much as possible. We finally got the shel rosh on him. And then we lowered the straps from both sides down in front of him on the bed, on top of the blanket. And I saw the Rashiva stroking the straps. And I saw his chavivas hamitzvah in that. He just, for a minute, he lay there and he just stroked the straps. Like he stroked something, a favorite thing. Stroked the straps. I was very touched by it. His Avos HaTorah and Avos HaMitzvahs. And by the way, Moshe Golding, American guy, I learned something from him. He went to daven mincha, and he stopped and put on a tie. And I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to daven mincha." He said, "What'd you put on a tie for?" In those days, we didn't wear ties. Something like our days. The only people who wore ties were the European yeshiva light, who were still a few left in the yeshivas. They wore ties. The Amerikaner guys didn't wear any ties. The yeshivas wore ties. Who wore a tie? It's a pain. He said, if I'm going to open an account in a bank, would I wear a tie when I go into the bank? If I'm going to speak to the Rebbeinu Shalom, I have to put on a tie also. That was Moshe Golding. He has good children. Yeah. I was asked once by a old Talmud of the Yeshivas, what we used to go on Lake with the Kletzkers. He said to me, "Do you think that the Yeshiva would have ever imagined that Lake would be like this?" Before I had answered, he didn't ask me that because he wanted me to answer, because he wanted to answer it himself. And before I even got the word out of my mouth, he said, never. He could never have imagined it would be like this. Never. Well, when he said this to me, it was probably something like 15, 20 years ago. And since then, it's become probably double or triple what it was. But I think that the Rosh Yeshiva, what happened to the Rosh Yeshiva with Lakewood, is the same thing the Rosh Yeshiva used to tell us about learning. She used to tell us the biggest mistake about learning is that you think, well, I learned 5 blot. I learned 10 blot. Okay, till the end of the Zman, I'll learn another few blot. And next year I'll learn another 10 blot, 20 blot. He says, that's a mistake. He said, what happens is you're measuring the wrong way. Torah information, he didn't say the word snowballs, but I'm using that for my own expression. It just grows far beyond your expectation. Yedias HaTorah grows beyond your expectation. It's not just piece by piece, and tomorrow's more. Tomorrow's a much more, and the day after that is much, much more. That's how it grows. You grow, you become you want to encourage us. You should know that you're going to grow and you're going to be great people. Well, the same thing happened to him. I said the same thing happened to Lakewood. He started off a handful of people. He started, I think, with 13 Talmidim originally. And the same thing happened to Lakewood. But it's not just Lakewood. I have to tell you, I think we're minimizing him if we just talk about Lakewood. There was a couple of guys who went to learn by the Brisker Rav. Later on by Reb Beryl. 2 or 3 or 4 went to learn in Brisk, Eretz Yisrael. Whoever heard of such a thing, go to Eretz Yisrael to learn. Whoever heard of that, it was I'm crazy. And to go learn Eretz in Brisk. What do you go to Brisk for, of all places? Brisk today has a tremendous olam. And there are Brisker yeshivas that broke away from Brisk, and they have themselves tremendous olam. My brother-in-law, and that olam is American. My brother-in-law, Rabbi Avram, told me that when they needed to daven mincha in the Mir Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, he would stand by the door and yell out, mincha, mincha, and get people to come in to make a minyan in the Mir Yeshiva. There wouldn't be no minyan for mincha. There wasn't a minyan in the yeshiva. So you had to call mincha by the door to the street. Mir Yeshiva is today one of the major, largest forces in Eretz Yisrael. American boys did that. Where did this come from, these American boys? Why did they come there? They're all the result of Lakewood, and it's all the same Yahrtzeit of the yeshivas that sprang up from Lakewood. They were, and that built Eretz Yisrael. That built Mir. Of course, Hebron was by itself, but that built Mir, built Brisk. It changed the whole attitude in Eretz Yisrael about learning. When the government had first allowed Yeshiva Baruchim to be excused from the draft 70 years ago, they were just talking about a few kids, a few guys. Now there's thousands in Eretz Yisrael. The Yeshiva used to say, imagine a schus of Rashi. Every time you look at Rashi, and he teaches you something, look at the schus that goes to Rashi for you learning a little piece of Rashi. Imagine the schus. Imagine the schus of the Rashi Zatzal. This is what happened in 60 years. Tomorrow will be 60 years. Imagine what's going to be in 100 years, in 200 years. The only revolution in the whole world. There'll be revolution in the whole world and it was really, I can't say he did everything, but he inspired everything. Many picked up the burden, having seen what he's done, They picked up the burden and went along. He made it possible for others to do the similar things that he did. Just by his betochen and his sheer willpower and his patience and knowing there was something that he could do. You have to do what you can. And Avad Rabbi say, I think that's something we should take away from his life. That everybody has to do what they can. Of course, you have to know that you can do a lot more than you want to think about. But you can. You have to be honest with yourself. You can do more. You can learn more. You can teach more. You can do more. There's enough energy and talent in this room to change the whole world. Without question. More than enough. But you have to do what you can. And it will be a schus for him, a continuous schus, immense schus. And if his face was shining when he put together the final points of a shir and made it all work, you can imagine how his face is shining when they see his lifetime work come together and click together in the next world. What a light is shining from him. Teinaf Yisur Zurachai.